So they'll have T-shirts like a chief firefighter or just kind of talking about the fact that they deal with shit all day. And I just think that's a sign of poor management. And it glorifies being hopeless at your job. If you're approaching business like that, you shouldn't be in business as an owner. You really want somebody whose goal is calm through organizational structures, for leadership, through management, through accountability, data, dashboards, projects. You can never get to doing good work if it's chaotic. You're not going to provide the best medical care in a chaotic environment. I would contend that that's not possible because the environment has to be set for excellence. And if it isn't, all of that stuff is going to detract from good quality care.
Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Todd Cameron. Hey, Todd, welcome.
Hi, Sachin. Thank you.
Now, today, we're talking about something. Todd and I talk to a lot of owners, both people we work with in Project X, but also owners who aren't in Project X. And one of the things that really comes up quite often, Todd, is this concept of my team are not meeting my expectations or my wishes. Sometimes an owner might say that overtly, like, I'm really not happy with how my expectations are being met. Other times they say it in another way, which is they make excuses or rationalize for their team, saying, oh, they're busy or things aren't getting done. And they may start by saying things are okay, but when we peel away the surface, they then reveal that actually a lot of what they expect or want is not happening. And so today, Todd, I thought for our viewers and listeners, it would be really useful to unpack perhaps why this might be happening, what it might look like when this happens, why it might be happening, and maybe how we can make it better or change it so that people are more accountable and the things we want as owners and the visions we have in our minds actually become reality. So Todd, maybe talk us through a bit more like how this problem sometimes shows itself, the symptoms.
Yeah, well, I think my first experience with this, Sachin, was it's going back some time. And I remember you and I received coaching as we coach others. And I remember being in a breakout room with others and I was complaining about the performance of my team. And somebody who I value really highly and owns a substantial business said, actually, Todd, the problem is you. And I was a little bit shocked. But they said, look, this is a failure of leadership. You, as leader, need to be accountable for the performance of your team. And until you accept that, you're not going to see improvement. So I think that's a really good frame to begin with because it's easy to whine about the performance of others. And look, we see it a lot, in many places. And that could go both ways. That could be the PM complaining about the owner and the owner complaining about the performance of the PM. Ultimately, it still comes down to a failure of leadership, management, and accountability. And the PM and the owner relationship, it is a relationship. So there's two individuals, and then there's the space between the two individuals, just like there are in couples or any other kind of relationship, friendships. And so you have to work on all three elements there. People need to work on their own personal performance and accountability, and they need to work on the way that they communicate their needs to each other and make sure that that's of a very, very high degree. So I think the foundation of good performing relationships is clarity. What are your expectations of me? And what do I expect of you? If I don't know what that is, it's very difficult for me to play the guessing game and be accurate. I'm most likely going to speculate and I'm going to be wrong in most cases. So understanding those expectations. And the problem here, Sachin, is that most people feel they might be over communicating when in fact the evidence is very clear that in the vast majority of cases in businesses, under communication is the problem. Anybody who's a parent will get this. How many times have you asked your kids to brush their teeth? Probably in the thousands. And so, the reality is you do need to over communicate if you want to get a reliable outcome. That's the first thing. And then I think the next thing that comes after that are standards. And so, one of the challenges with being a doctor and an owner is the work in medicine can be really spirit heavy. It can be really task heavy and it can be really decision dense. And so that can leave you fatigued and somewhat tired And what it can do is it can mean that you become a bit of a tolerance machine because you're just not up for another fight. You're kind of done and often emotionally exhausted. Your empathy might have worn out. And so you just tolerate things that should not be tolerated. But we hear a lot about the standards you walk past, the standards you accept, and you really do need to start demanding higher standards. And I think with this kind of stuff, you look at whatever your favorite sporting team is in whatever endeavor, the best teams have really high standards. They don't tolerate behaviors that are not part of success, that are not part of winning. And I think in businesses, we sometimes run them more like families, which is more about unconditional love and tolerance and acceptance than about, you know what, this needs to be a higher performing team. Even if it's not a high performing team, and people need to be accountable. When you give them something, they need to hold it until it's seen through, or they give it back because there is some obstacle that was unforeseen, or they needed to reprioritize. It should be really clear in that way. So I think those are often the kind of the layers that generate the problems that we see, Sachin.
Cool. You've described sort of clarity and maybe a lack of clarity. We've talked about standards and tolerating mediocre standards. And then we've talked about communication. If that's a problem, how does it show up? How would I know it's a problem? What things might I observe? What sort of things might people say to me if I'm an owner? Because I might not be aware that it's even happening. So what sort of things would you say are not acceptable to hear or experience as an owner or group of owners in a practice?
Yeah, I think the number one symptom of this is lots of interruptions. So what happens is that there's not a place to capture all of the things to talk about in a strategic and tactical way. And so what they show up is interruptions. And so that might literally mean being doorstopped in between patients to make decisions on really important matters, and just having that key person bottleneck where you're always having to give feedback on something just because of insufficient clarity. You'll get lots of emails. Often this stuff is after hours as well, Sachin, with conversations by text or WhatsApp or whatever method outside of the normal working hours. There's just more chaos around than there should be. And people consider it as being unpredictable. But when you look at it, it's actually completely predictable. You know, the same problems happen on the same days and in the same months every year, and have done since Adam played halfback for the Apostles. It's just a recurring problem of like Groundhog Day with some people. And you see some PMs and owners wear this as a badge of pride. So they'll have T-shirts like chief firefighter, or just kind of talking about the fact that they deal with shit all day. And I just think that's a sign of poor management. And it glorifies being hopeless at your job. It really, really pisses me off to see people laughing at and poking fun at this, because the reality is, if you're approaching business like that, you shouldn't be in business as an owner if you think that's the way it's done. And you shouldn't have that PM in your business. You really want somebody whose goal is calm through organizational structures, for leadership, through management, through accountability, data, dashboards, projects. You want somebody who runs all that stuff metronomically. In fact, they do it so well that it's a little bit boring and there is no chaos, because that person is able to predictably manage it. So I think glorifying chaos and this kind of idea that accepting that your world is going to be chaotic is a really big problem, because that usually means they're hanging around the wrong people. They've got the wrong yardsticks. They're competing against the wrong people. And maybe they have the wrong, not necessarily the wrong people, but the wrong attitude and the wrong standards in there as to what is acceptable. Because the reality is, you can never get to doing good work if it's chaotic. You're not going to provide the best medical care in a chaotic environment. I would contend that that's not possible, because the environment has to be set for excellence. And if it isn't, if the staff are changing regularly, processes aren't followed, whether a patient pays or not is a crapshoot, all of that stuff is going to detract from good quality care. And so I think that this mantra that chaos is okay and it's a part of what we do is patently ridiculous, and it's unsafe for patients, as well as a really poor place to work. It's not good for your arousal system, because you're just going to get triggered regularly with interruptions. And over time, the thing that we see that kind of troubles me the most is just people lower their expectations to meet the environment rather than maintaining high expectations and thinking, maybe I need to change the environment. Maybe I need to do something about this. So that's probably the symptoms that are underlying this. You probably have a few more to add, Sachin. What have you observed?
Now, I was making notes as you were talking because I was just thinking back to times when I've experienced this in my ownership career. So the chaos and the interruptions. I remember a PM that I had early days in our ownership journey who wasn't doing their job and used to interrupt like that, sometimes about quite important business decisions. And in fact, I remember one time they interrupted, and then because I'd asked them, let's capture it and have it in set meeting times, they actually left the building and walked out. So, I remember that early in my business journey. The other one, I think, just listening to you, when we talk to owners and then going, online, you see managers groups and other groups online. There is that group where they don't actually even think it would ever be possible to operate in calmness. It's like a conditioning. And I think that what you just described, like a badge of honor, it's actually almost something that people are addicted to, that chaotic sort of nature. The one, though, that sticks out for me above all was I remember well over a decade ago, we were preparing for accreditation. You normally have many months of runway to that. And previously it had all been done on Word, and then we'd moved the business to Google, so it was all in the cloud now. And accreditation was on Monday, and I remember on Friday at 4 p.m., 3 members of the team came and said, we haven't done the manual because you didn't train us in Google, and just left it at myself and my business partner's feet. And I remember that weekend, like working.
That is just a low point in accountability and being comfortable putting you right in it.
Yeah. And I remember that weekend, me and my business partner having to write all of our accreditation manuals across 2 sites. It was for one site, but we had the same thing across, or go over it at least and move it into Google and edit it. Plenty of time for people to say we're off track or it's not working, and there were plenty of meetings for that. It was done potentially maliciously at that time, and that was useful because it actually broke our tolerance for this type of thing. But those are the types of things. But sometimes I think you don't act because you're scared that if you act, those people will leave and the business will implode. And so you almost tolerate it and make excuses for it because you're fearful of them leaving.
Yeah, I've made that mistake many times, Sachin, keeping someone around that wasn't up to scratch because I feared the work related to them not being there. Every time I've regretted that. I've never once thought, that was a good call. Every time I've thought, man, that person should have gone a long time ago. And even without them, life is usually better before the replacement comes. So, yeah, I do think that's an important call. It's probably important to talk about the first priority when you identify this. So when people are listening, it can be really easy to think, let's get rid of the person, right? And that's kind of the knee-jerk response, isn't it? But that should be the last thing to do. And the reason for that is that before we make any decisions on people, we need to check the ecology, just check the environment is supportive and conducive of doing good work and the right work, and that the structure sets that person up for success. So they've got the right accountabilities, they have the right span of control, they have clear data and metrics that are feedback on what they're doing, because the chances are that the role has been poorly engineered, or more commonly not engineered at all. It is just the PM's job is to do everything. And so good luck with that. So I think it's important to recognize that when we're making the people decisions, that's at the end of kind of running through all of those other processes.
Yeah. So let's do this now. So we've done diagnosis, right? We've done symptoms and sort of diagnosis now, diagnosis and treatment. And they're probably mixed in this setting, I'd say. So maybe take us through your algorithm for how we might, this was one of those clinical pathways, beautiful diagrams or charts of, do this, do that. What order would you address this? Like, how would you go about addressing it?
Yeah. I think, Sachin, it's probably useful to talk about a good guidebook. And this book by Gino Wickman called Traction is really useful. Really important to say, I'm going to give you a few books today that you can read. And all of the work that we do in Project X is embedded around somewhere between 18 to 20 great books. The key themes have been translated into the general practice environment and all of the content and training built with that in mind. But this is one book that we've used as a loose foundation for the type of relationship between the owner and the PM. Gino Wickman calls these, because this is the entrepreneurial operating system, shorthand is EOS. They call it the visionary, which would be the owner, and the integrator, which would be the PM. So the visionary's job tends to be big ideas, big relationships, strategic calls on the direction of the business, and the cultural anchor for the business most commonly. And then most of the operational elements of the business fall to the integrator / the PM. And so the first thing to do is actually to look at what are the current roles and responsibilities for both parties. And one of the things here, Sachin, that is a red flag is when two people have the same accountability. And people think it's good because they think it's just a redundancy. So both Sachin and I look after ... because if one of us isn't here, the other one can do it, or whatever it might be. But what in fact happens is diffusion of responsibility. So when two people are responsible for something, nobody's responsible for it. And I think that's the best mantra to have here. And so typically what happens when you start looking at the accountability chart, which is what EOS calls a traditional org chart, you'll see that accountabilities are mixed at all layers. And it really needs to be teased out, often on a whiteboard between the owner and the PM, just to get a really high degree of clarity about all of the things that are done. And sometimes it's useful to capture everything you do over a 2-week block, just to see what is it that I'm actually taking action on, what are my accountabilities, what are the tasks that I'm doing, and then bringing them to a meeting where you can make sure that you get all of it out. And it's kind of obvious, but the 2-week block should represent, business as usual. Ideally, you get all those things out. And if you capture something later on, that's okay. Just add it to the list and keep talking about it. And then what you'll usually find is that almost all of the accountabilities in the business are held at the owner and PM level, and not many are delegated to the levels below. The head of the admin team, if the team's big enough, the head of the nursing team. And even if those are not heads, they're just reception team, there may be an offshore VA and a nursing team, those people should still have individual accountabilities, which is more specific than do nursing, do admin, just do all the stuff that's at the desk. And this is the type of work that is slow, boring, and a little bit shitty, right? And then I promise you'll find a few things. You'll find things where there are overlapping accountability, so multiple people having accountability for something. And then the other thing you'll find is that there are accountabilities that nobody has picked up, that there are some that you actually think, I thought you were doing that. And they'll be pointing at you saying, I thought you were doing that. And then you realize, holy cow, no one's looking after the WIP payments, or no one's looking after this particular data upload. And so you're going to find a bunch of stuff that isn't being done as you go through it. And it's just really slow, methodical work. I mean, it's the sort of thing, if you want to shortcut this, you can easily come and join a coaching program where you get access to all the lists. But the reality is, if you're going to do it yourself, that's the key part of this. I think in terms of some other books, Sachin, I might just share those now that are useful. This is probably my favorite book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution for Setting what we call lead activities and lag metrics. And so this is by Chris McChesney and Sean Covey and a few others. The key idea in this is that most goals, most targets that are number-based, are lag measures. So say, for example, you said we want to get CCM and health assessment income to 25% of our billings. That's a lag outcome. And the lead activity is, what is the first thing in the chain of activities that lead to that outcome that you need to make sure happens? That might be, making sure the nurses have enough appointment time in their book. It might be outreach to patient list to fill that up. A lot of different things in here. You and I have done some great work with Stacey Barr, who does have a principle she calls pump, big P, small u, big M, big P. That's another book that people could read on this, but we've done some work. We went straight to the expert and did some work on that. The other book that's a really good read on this, Andy Gove is the forefather of modern leadership, management, and accountability at Intel and also Google. So that's a great read to have a look at. And this is an old book now, but the principles don't change. Humans are pretty well the same. So this stuff doesn't really change. There are a couple of really good authors that cover off on how to play a bigger game. Liz Wiseman, I really love for this. I know Sarah that we work with is a big fan. That's where I got this from. This book is Impact Players, and it just she's got another great one called Multipliers, and it just talks about the attributes of A graders versus B graders. And we have this great saying for A graders when we work with them in Project X versus B graders. So A graders are people who show up, do the work, meet their accountability goals, and ask for help when they get stuck. That's an A grader. B graders are people who complain about the outcomes they didn't get from the work they didn't do. Unfortunately, B graders are by far the most common people. And you'll pick them because they're just whingers. They just whinge about stuff. And so typically what they are is they like to dream, they have ideas, but they just never actually execute anything. And, you know, ideas are a dime a dozen. They do not get you to the end result. You need to become a master executor to get there. And so that's really the kind of knowledge that we can apply to this. As I said, the shortcut is go somewhere where that's already embedded in the training. But those are probably a good start on the books. The other book that I didn't grab off the shelf is probably Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I think that's a ripper for just learning about where are the traps, where is the quicksand, how is it that teams don't build trust to get to the right layers. Sachin, I think you had a book or two to share as well. So we might as well do this during the bibliography right here.
Absolutely. We'll put all these books in the show notes. This is a small read, look thin, super useful. Creating a Culture of Accountability by Mark Green with Glenn Dahl. Won't forget Glenn. Really simple, not easy, but simple to implement. And I think all of these books, they highlight the importance of clarity, as you talked about earlier, standards, measuring, getting people to self-report in an open forum, and holding a cadence, and then acting when things aren't on track. They all talk about that, and making it okay and safe to have these conversations. They're not intended to smash people around the head with. They're intended to help people as individuals. We talk about in the Practice Success Blueprint about human capital. It's about elevating people to the best they can be. But we need to create the environment that allows people to be the best they can be. And the ones who can't elevate or who aren't willing to elevate, we create an environment where they can self-select or be selected out. But the environment needs to be right first before we get to those decisions.
Yes, Sachin. So I think one of the problems here is that people are often afraid of declaring that they want to be better and just proceeding with making some changes because that's going to cause friction. Friction is really important in growth, the right type of friction. And it does take time to build a layer of trust before you kind of move forward with that friction. But what you'll find out is who's up for the job. And again, if I go back to the sporting team analogy, if your team's down the bottom part of the ladder, the odds are that at the end of every season, they'll have to make some tough decisions. They're deciding who are the players that are going to take them to the promised land and who are the ones who probably aren't up for the job. And they'll just start pruning that list. Some of those might be your favorite players. They might be people that you really like. They might be good people. And the same thing is true of business. Just because that person isn't right for your business right now doesn't mean anything about them as a person. It just means they're not right for your business right now and somebody else will be, which is why you need to work on the environment first. There's no point trying to plant flowers in soil that is toxic. You need to make sure that you get the ecology right, that the soil is right, that you're nurturing that for the future stars that you're going to be planting and having bloom in your team. And if that's right, the odds are that when you do recruit the right people, that they'll not only stick around, but they'll take the business to a higher level. And even better, they actually know more about the business than you, because in that old environment, it's probably you that's driving things in areas that you aren't an expert. And that is a big problem in businesses. This might be an opportunity, Sachin, to talk about the difference between leaders that tend to collaborate versus those who like to have decisions that are communal decision, because that's a big trap for owners. And you might have an example or two that you've thought of or that you've seen where people have gotten a bit confused about what the purpose of leadership is in terms of in that leadership environment, who makes the call and who sits with the call?
Yeah. So, and I think this ties into hard conversations as well. So just before I answer that, I think one of the other things we haven't touched on yet is people avoid hard conversations because they feel that it will affect the way they're liked. And I think that's just important to have out there. That when you avoid friction, which is the hard conversation, you really avoid the clarity that brings. I think most people avoid those tough conversations. I think that has to be said. So I think the types of things that you'll often see in leadership when it's misguided is we try and lead by consensus. So it's almost a committee. We get round a table. Shall we do this? What do you think? What do you think, Helen? What do you think, John? What do you think, Naveen? What do you think, Ishani? What do you think? And then we sit there and then we're in this paralyzed state where we can't get consensus. And because the consensus can't be reached, the decision is not made. In my opinion, the purpose of leadership is collaborative leadership, is to listen to the information, take in the inputs. So you have the inputs, then you'll have some data. You say data, I say data, which is information that will support those other inputs you've had. And then you have your own experience, knowledge, and expertise as a leader. And there's two elements to that. There's the learnt skills, and then there's the experience sort of spider senses. There's like a mix. And I think when all of that comes together and your own skills, take in the inputs, then whoever's accountable for something then should make the decision. So there's a person accountable. They should, as part of being a good leader, take in the relevant inputs when relevant, and then make the call. And everyone else's job is to get behind that person, whether they agree or don't agree. They've had their say, and then it's about loyal disagreement rather than disloyal disagreement. So loyal disagreement is where, yeah, I disagreed with that. However, as part of the team, and it's your accountability, I'm going to get behind you, and we're all going to work to make this decision a success. Versus disloyal disagreement, where as soon as the decision's made, the person's in back channels and ears trying to poison others, which is politicking, poisoning others against the initiative that was decided on by the person accountable.
Yeah, I think loyal disagreement is one of my favorite Lencioni-isms because it is a reality. And so in a meeting, for example, where people have shared their perspectives and you know that somebody disagrees with the course that you're choosing, it's really important as the leader to check back in with that person and say, hey, James, did you think that you could follow this course of action? I know you had a strong opinion otherwise, but you're going to need to be loyal to this agreement. Is that something that you can do? It also means that nobody has the right to come back and say, I told you this wouldn't work, as you said, politicking. Or the opposite of that, which is Sachin always has all the good ideas and we should listen to him. The objective of effective collaboration is to get all of the ideas out so that we have the full breadth of experience and opinions on the table, and then we can choose from the best. If people never feel safe to share their opinions, then that's likely to be harmful to the business and to the leadership. So it's really important that we don't go back and revisit who said or who didn't say. And in an ideal world, the collaboration that comes around through leadership and the leadership team should be that they hammer ideas such out that whoever started it doesn't obviously get remembered. It might well be that, the ideas are banged around until they take a different shape. And that's the right type of friction that we want to see from teams. So, yeah, that's an excellent one, Sachin. Thank you.
Cool. So now we've approached how we might address this. Tell us a bit more. So we've covered the tough conversations, we've covered expectations and accountability. What next?
I think the other thing that is a common issue here is that most PMs will be holding too much accountability themselves. So you sort of have this habit of over accountability, often at ownership level, and that's repeated at the PM level. And so one thing to often begin with is to teach delegation. How do you delegate something that you don't abdicate? So you don't just ignore and give it to somebody else, or that it bounces back because the delegation has been of insufficient quality for clarity and understanding. So If you think about a time that you've offloaded a role at home, so I'll think about my son washing the car, which I'm going to say happens occasionally, but he washes the car to a degree that's probably 85 to 90% of what I would do. And it involves none of my labor. Now, for those of you worrying about child abuse, I do pay him for this work, and it is a fair market rate. However, I've got a photo of my son. He probably would have been about 10 when I started this process, and he is sitting in the bucket of soapy water. So his bum is fully at the bottom, and at the top, he's got knees falling out and his head's falling out. So what I'm going to tell you is that it was a very, very long path. However, I knew I had two goals in mind. One was that he would wash his own car at some future point, but also that if he wanted to earn some extra money, I like to have a clean car. I saw that there would be a marrying of those two things. And so over the course of probably 4 to 5 years and 20 to maybe 25 car washes, he started from where he was probably worse than useless. At the start, it would take me longer and the quality was less good. But in my head, I had this image. I saw this picture of a person that just said to their child, go and wash my car. And this person had a Lexus. And that was all he said to his son. That was the complete delegation. This is a perfect example of poor delegation. Anyway, about an hour later, this guy goes out to check on his car. Kid's out there with a bucket with soapy water and a scourer because that's what he sees mum doing the dishes with in the sink. So this guy's car is half paint scoured off. That's exactly, so probably a $20,000, $30,000 harm done by really poor delegation. But that's a really good analogy for what crappy delegation does. So with my kids, it was, okay, the objective is to clean the car and not damage the car. The number one priority is don't damage the car. The ways you can do that is using the wrong products, using the wrong tools, doing it in bright sunlight. You know, you need to have shade. You give them all of the do's and don'ts. And I stood there with him for every single car wash, for every single part of it until I had demonstrated it. He had demonstrated it back, and it was done with sufficient quality that I would say, yep, that's passed. And so we did have some funny moments where when a car's wet, you can't tell if it's still dirty in places. So you do need to have a good process for kind of doing, you know, one way across a panel and then another way across a panel. And so the next morning, I would take photos of the car and send them to him and say, I'm going to need some money back because it's not a complete wash, you know, it was a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So it takes time, right? So the first thing is you've got to be patient with it. If you're not patient with a delegation, it won't stick. And you need to provide the why framework. Why is this important? And what happens if it doesn't get done properly? And then you need to make sure you've got a clear metric that you can keep track of to make sure that that role continues to be done to a high standard, that it's not being dropped at any point in time. But just say you pick, you know, 1, 2, 3 areas that are high in their consumption of time, particularly if they are things that arise ad hoc. You know, so they kind of steal time from you. They might only be 5 or 10 minute things, but if that happens 5 times a day and it interrupts your deep work, then it probably costs you 3 or 4 hours a day in reality. So pick some things that you think these could easily be done by the team. And I'll give you an example here. Things like collecting patient debts, you know, people that haven't paid for their consultations. Sometimes there's someone in the team who loves this kind of work. Like they just morally object to people not paying their bills. They would never have an unpaid bill. And so they're just like, right, this isn't right. I'm going to get onto these people. I'm going to solve it. There likely is somebody like that in the team already. And so you just say, hey, I've got something that I really like to take you on. It involves this. We'd make sure we protect some time for you so you could do this work. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in? Yes, awesome. All right, let's make some time. Let's build a delegation framework. And you'll get delegation frameworks from those books. We use our own delegation framework in Project X, but you'll be able to create your own that works. And then you just keep refining it until it gets to a point where people have a very high clarity about what your expectations are when they say yes. There's kind of no area that's unspoken or unsaid, and they know it'll be tracked and monitored afterwards because that's how you're going to make sure that these things, these flywheels keep spinning. And then as you start to get good at delegating, you'll free your own time up as well. So I think probably the first part of this is to actually help your PM with building those delegations. And then as you do that, you're teaching yourself and them how to both build delegation and receive it between the owner and the PM layer. Probably one more thing I'll say on that, Sachin, which is really important, is part of the EOS framework with the visionary integrator is that the integrator or the PM is the one who determines the capacity of the team. And so what that means is they can say no to new projects that attempt to be pushed in by the visionary, just because visionaries are often an ideas factory. Say they go to something like Ponk or, one of those kind of conferences, come back with a whole bunch of ideas, and they're like, right, I want you to do this, 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 this. The PM has the right to say, okay, these are the 3 or 4 things I'm working on at the moment. Ideally, it's less than that in terms of projects, but they'd say, look, I can do that. Which one of these 2 things would you like me to stop and disregard? You need to have a really strong PM that protects the capacity of the team and that people are running it. I would say, happy for your opinion on this, but if they're running at about 80%, that's probably about right. Trying to push people beyond that that last bit is fairly inelastic, and you can push people into burnout or failure, which is not great for anybody. So running them at the right rate is important. And then if the PM says we don't have capacity to do that at the moment, you got 2 choices. One is change the capacity of your team. 2 is get some external assistance, which means bringing in some capacity, which could be temporary / project type work. That's possible as well. And the 3rd option is, changing the PM if that is the actual problem. You got somebody who's just not able to find and build capacity and get delegations happening, build automations. It may be that it's not the right person, but as with the first decision, that is always the last call. You make sure you've checked everything else before you say, actually, this looks like a problem with the person. Most likely it's a problem with you as a leader.
Absolutely. The one caveat to that is obviously if they're not a values match, then, and you've done some work to see if you can adjust their values, if that's not going to happen, then they're not going to fit regardless of how they do their role. All right. So you've given some really useful tips there. Let's maybe, as we come to a close, have you got a story or an example where someone's done this well and it just encapsulates what it should be like?
Yeah, I think the areas where, if I was to pick a timeline for this to kind of get to a point where it's right, I reckon it's 6 to 18 months. So this is the old, it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. So part of it is committing to the fact that this is the right person for your business right now, and kind of not having the maybe I could do better idea. You really need to fully commit to getting the relationship working right. There's been so many owners that we've worked with, Sachin, where this has worked really well. And mostly it's been that there is room available for deep and longer conversations at the start. Because I think that the foundational rule here is with people, fast is slow and slow is fast. So what that means is just making space for conversations that add to clarity, that really tease out expectations, that allow you to go back over things time and time again until you both walk away and think, right, I think we've got a good shared understanding of this now. So people who think that others should be mind readers. So if you're an owner that you think people should be able to mind read what you want, or just after one statement have a really high degree of clarity, you probably shouldn't be leading a team like that. That's not the right approach, and it's not likely to be a winning approach. So time and space in order to hammer it out. And the other thing is you need to be comfortable feeling vulnerable. And when I say that, I mean just saying, oh, look, I actually don't know exactly how to do this. I find this hard, and I am prepared to stick with it until we get it right. That's really important. And so setting a realistic time frame, I think, is the other part of it. So if you do think this is probably going to take us 6 to 18 months to get to a point where we have a really high degree of trust with each other and a high degree of operational leverage through our communications, that is still going to be a really worthwhile outcome, because at that point in time, somewhere between 6 and 18 months, you're going to have a business relationship that takes you a long way. And what I'm going to say is, if you look at every successful business, they're always pairs. always pairs. Now, sometimes you might not know the name of the other person, but they're always there. And so that is the secret of business success, is to have a great leader and a great manager. And if you don't work on that relationship and you don't give it time and you're not vulnerable to allow it to blossom, you will never get there. So if you're a low trust person, I don't want to trust people because they let me down or whatever other things, you need to do some work on yourself. That's probably the key thing, I think, here, Sachin. And when you see this work, this is brilliant, isn't it? And what I will say is that the people that have had it to a point where it works really well, and for some reason that person moves out, usually because there's a different opportunity they would like, or there's some other reason why that's happened, getting the next person in that's high trust actually happens really quickly, because you know much better what to look for in recruiting, and that person moves into an environment they go, wow, this is amazing. I really love what these people are doing. And so you arrive at that spot much more quickly the second time around, I think.
Absolutely. I shared a story earlier about accreditation. My favorite, one of our members who recently was describing their accreditation experience, shows how it should be. Her practice passed accreditation, but what she said is, my total sum involvement in the whole process was 12 minutes, which was the interview with the practice principal. And I thought that was a perfect example of how it should be and how it could be when you've spent time and attention on this. This owner hasn't done it over a short time. They've done it over 4, 5, 6 years. They've had it since the 2-year mark, I'd say, with their manager, but it still continues to elevate and improve, to culminate in that example. And so I think that's a perfect place for us to stop. Thanks again, Todd, today.
Thank you, Sachin.
I think if you're here and you've noticed some of those symptoms, the big message here is the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And we've given you some examples of how it can be when it's structured right and the environment's right. There's absolutely no reason that can't be achieved in any environment. And so on a personal level, it's important, if you are to achieve the things you want, then a big part of it is going to be the standards of the team that support you. It starts with you, and then the team must follow. And if they don't, then we need to address that. Otherwise, we'll struggle to get where we want to. I've been Sachin.
I've been Todd.
Thank you so much. See you next time.